I had this idea that we have been laboring under this cascade of structural violence. And then somebody came along and said, no, forget about that cascade. Let's do this other cascade. Because this other cascade will get you where you want to go. And I was thinking, how can that cascade get us where we, if this other cascade was important, but we just abandoned it because another cascade came along, then how is this other cascade going to get us where we want to go? But I was also struck about, here we are talking about this other cascade. When I say we, I mean the black communities in which I circulate. Some other people, really other, come along and said, well, let's do this other cascade instead. And I'm thinking, how is that other cascade going to work if those of us who've been talking about this other cascade are not also involved in those discussions about the new cascade? So that is when I came up with this idea about the cascade of structural violence. So, of course, and there are a few people that I like to thank for helping me think through this. So this is the usual view of the cascade that 90% of the people who are living with HIV would be tested, and then of those, 90% will be on treatment, and 90% of those will then achieve viral suppression, which means that if this is possible, then we could end HIV, or at least end it as we know it. So as far as I was able to gather using data from 2015 that has been published by the OHTN, this is what the cascade looks like in Ontario. So it looks pretty good, right? Okay. So in thinking about this other cascade, I was also, thinking about we have this cascade of things that fell on us. So then I remembered, I only remembered this through Denzel Washington's performance in the movie. And he was so moving, and I said, but wait, did Malcolm actually say that, or did Spike Lee just make it up? So I actually went and looked for the actual quote, And Denzel didn't actually say it like this, because of course he's an actor and he had to make it more dramatic. But, we didn't land on Plymouth Rock. Plymouth Rock landed on us. So that's the cascade that we were dealing with. This cascade of violence, these things that fell on us. So, and in thinking about this, I asked myself three questions, and I don't have the answers for them, but maybe you'll help me answer them today. First of all, can we ride this cascade to a beneficial outcome while being massively affected by structural violence? And the second question is, does the cascade actually say anything about structural violence? And my third question is, does the cascade specify targets for addressing structural violence? Because as you see, the cascade, the engagement cascade that we're familiar with, it has targets that, 90% of people should know their status, and 90% of those should be on treatment, and 90% of those should achieve viral suppression and so on. So that's where my final statement, my final question came from. Now, normally we think of, structural violence. So I call this, instead of using the familiar term disparities, I look at these things as markers of structural violence. So here we are about, HIV diagnoses in Ontario. And you can see how black communities are sort of massively affected by HIV. For Canada as a whole, here, once again, it's a similar picture. Actually, as far as I know, I believe that Aboriginal women also accounted for 35% of all the reported cases in 2016 among women. So that would mean that black women and Aboriginal women would together account for like 70%. And that's a massive thing. We should all be sort of scratching our heads about how to deal with that. But HIV is just what we see. When we work in HIV, this is what we know, this is what we see, these data about testing and prevalence and all these things. But we have to peel back these layers to sort of think about, well, what it is are we really talking about here? Because obviously it must be just this is just the end point of something. So I try to peel back the layers and look at income, look at the massive disparities in income. A quarter of African Canadians have low income nationally compared to just 12% of people who are 12% for the country as a whole. That is including everybody. And then we look at there's a way in which we can understand this. If you're from the Caribbean or from the South, that the prison has replaced the plantation. So we're still in this thing. It's just that instead of being on the plantation, as my forefathers would have been back up until the 1830s, now we're sort of somewhere else. But really, in a sense, even though we've achieved something materially, in comparison to the other people around us, we're still sort of almost back where we were. And this kind of thing makes good copy in the news, of course, writing about black men, who violate white women. So let's be clear, this is all about black men and white women. It's not about, these stories. So, and this is a familiar narrative as well. One of the interesting things about HIV is that HIV has resurrected discourses which we thought we had gone past. So these discourses about black men and women and their sexuality and their sexual behaviors, these were discourses that, maybe in the 1970s or the 1980s even, people thought, well, that was something of the past. But these discourses now have come back with the way how we understand HIV. And sometimes, not sometimes, but there's always new technologies, of course, to deal with the problems that we face. But the issue is that many times these new technologies leave us where we are. So the disparity remains. Everybody gets better off to some extent, but certain communities still remain where they were relative, and that is the problem with new technologies. So a nod to my man, Laurent. This is a paper that came out recently, and I would, maybe you can't see it, but you should read it. And it's, you should read the paper, not read it here. A recipe for increasing racial and gender disparities in HIV infection, a critical analysis of the Canadian guidelines on pre-exposure prophylactics and non-occupational post-exposure prophylaxis, responsiveness to HIV epidemics among women and black communities. It's a long title, but you'll get the picture. But anyway, thanks to my man Laurent who led this. So this is my last slide. I'm going to stop here. What these data tell us is one thing, but how this gets translates into our everyday reality is in terms of the common sense ways in which people interpret what they see. So how do people interpret the fact that, black men or black people account for 10% of the prison population in federal institutions, but black people are only, 3% of Canada's population? So how do we explain the high prevalence of HIV among black communities, for example? So the numbers say one thing, and then people attempt to interpret these numbers, in a way that fits a certain picture that they have. And in my work with HIV and heterosexual black men, these are some of the things that I've come across, some of the ways in which people want to understand black men. And these are ideas, in fact, that are even disseminated amongst researchers themselves. So you read some of the research articles and this is where we are. So I'm going to stop here. So what I've done, I haven't solved anything, but I hope I've given you a question to think about the cascade, a moment to pause and think about what it is we're talking about and where we're going to go with this. And at the end of the day, because my fear is that at the end of the day, decision makers will declare victory over HIV. Somebody will say, well, the cascade tells us that we are done. But there will be some of us left. There will be some communities left that are still struggling with HIV. But when the decision makers decide that we are done, then it means that the resources also go elsewhere. And we are left to struggle with this on our own. So this is not my issue, but this should be an issue around which we are organizing. And this is the only way I think that we're going to get this message heard. Thank you.